They say power doesn't need to announce itself. It arrives with a whisper, not a roar. So when Darius Coleman stepped aboard Flight 919, no one heard thunder. But if they had paid attention, they might have felt the pressure shift. He moved through the first-class cabin with a calm purpose. Not arrogance, no. This was different. This was a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. His tailored navy suit hung perfectly from his broad shoulders, a quiet emblem of a life built on resilience and precision. The kind of man whose wristwatch didn't flash wealth, but whispered legacy. Click, click, click. Each polished step he took on the plush carpet was muted but deliberate, as if every inch of the aisle belonged to him already. He didn't glance around in curiosity or awe. He belonged here. The smell of linen, faint champagne, the hush of controlled luxury. These were no longer novelties to Darius. They were norms. And yet, even norms can become battlefields. Seat 1A welcomed him with a window view, the kind executives favored when crossing continents for mergers. Geneva tomorrow. $1 billion deal. A handshake that could reshape markets across 2 continents. But for now, all of that rested quietly in his leather satchel. Today's fight, unexpected and personal, was about something else. Darius slid into the seat unhurried. As the flight attendants busied themselves down the aisle, he powered up his tablet and began reviewing notes. His fingers glided across graphs and strategy slides with the confidence of someone who had authored every single number on the page. This merger, months in the making, was going to be the centerpiece of a larger empire. His empire. He barely registered the footsteps that approached until a well-rehearsed voice broke through his focus. "Good evening, sir," the attendant greeted with a courteous smile. She offered a menu as if she were handing him a formality, not an invitation. Darius returned a polite nod and placed the menu on his tray without opening it. "I've pre-ordered," he said simply. "Lobster bisque, filet mignon." He didn't say it like a request. He said it like a truth, like gravity. The attendant's smile stiffened by a fraction so small the untrained eye would miss it. She nodded quickly and turned her heels, clicking briskly toward the galley. Darius watched her go for a second longer than necessary. Something in her gait, in the slight tension of her shoulders, tripped a wire deep inside his intuition. He had been in too many boardrooms, too many negotiations not to notice the tiny signals people tried to hide. His eyes drifted out the window as clouds slid past like slow dancers. The hum of the engine merged with the quiet murmur of other first-class passengers, men in their 50s, white, relaxed, sipping drinks they didn't need to order. This was a world Darius had long since broken into. But every now and then, the world liked to remind him that some doors still had locks, invisible ones you don't see until you hear the click from inside. He didn't know yet, but this flight would become one of those moments. A silent threshold. A quiet war declared not with words, but with shrimp cocktails and shrugging shoulders. And as the plane climbed through the clouds, Darius Coleman leaned back in seat 1A, unaware that the battle for dignity had already begun. 15 minutes into the flight, the lights dimmed to a soft golden hue. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of menus, and the discreet murmur of orders created a gentle rhythm across the first-class cabin. A performance of elegance, well-rehearsed, well-funded, and well-executed. At least for most passengers. Darius remained poised, eyes on his tablet, reviewing the final legal clause of a shareholder agreement that would push his company's market cap past $3 billion. He wasn't just thinking about contracts, he was refining control. Power wasn't static. It was constantly being negotiated, redefined, reclaimed. Especially for men who looked like him, in rooms that weren't made for him. He barely noticed the same attendant returning until her shadow cut across his screen. She stopped beside his seat, her face composed, but her eyes, those gave her away. A practiced smile was tugging at her lips, but it didn't quite reach the corners. It was the smile of someone performing, rather than connecting. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, in a tone that was designed to sound sincere, but landed somewhere between forced and indifferent. "We're out of the luxury meals. You'll need to choose from the regular menu." Darius blinked once slowly. "Out?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "I pre-ordered 3 days ago." The attendant gave a shrug, nonchalant, almost mechanical. Sometimes the system doesn't register properly. It happens. She turned to walk away before he could respond, her back as dismissive as her tone. It happens. Two words, hollow and weightless, dropped like stones onto a foundation that had taken years to build. Darius stared at her retreating figure, jaw tight but unmoving. His expression remained unreadable to anyone watching, but inside something had shifted. Not rage, not yet, but an unmistakable click. Like a lever being pulled. The other passengers around him received their meals, caviar, lobster wine, served from bottles that cost more than the average rent. He received a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a lukewarm plastic cup of water. No explanation, no apology, no attempt at service recovery, and no mistake. He had flown Stratus Air more than 30 times in the last 5 years. He'd sat in 1A on routes from Tokyo to Toronto. He'd had the same order confirmed, the same privileges guaranteed. This wasn't a glitch in the system. This was a decision made by a person who had already decided who he was before she asked his name. He took the sandwich off the tray and placed it aside untouched. His stomach wasn't empty, but something else was something deeper. His eyes lifted from the tray and scanned the cabin. 6 other men, all white, all dressed like him, all sipping wine and joking about fundraisers and golf courses. One even nudged a flight attendant playfully as she poured his second glass of champagne. No one glanced at Darius. No one needed to. That was how power worked in places like this, by omission, by subtle exclusions. No dramatic insults, no shouts across the cabin, just quiet edits to the script. A man removed from the spotlight before he ever got to speak. Darius adjusted his cufflinks and inhaled slowly, eyes narrowing. There was no scene to make, no complaint to shout. There was only silence and the weight of its message. The sandwich sat there like a taunt, pale, unseasoned, an edible metaphor wrapped in wax paper. Darius didn't touch it, didn't even glance at it again. But its presence on his tray was like a siren call, reminding him that in a space meant for dignity, he had been quietly relegated to second-class treatment. All while wearing the same watch, same tailored suit, and holding the same platinum ticket as the others. His fingers began to tap a steady rhythm on the armrest. 1, 2, 1, 2. It was barely audible, but it was there, a cadence of restraint. He kept his face composed, expression calm, but inside the drumbeat was growing. This wasn't just about the meal anymore. It never had been. It was about the invisible calculation that had been made the moment she saw him. A mental equation that ended with the verdict, not one of us. And Darius knew that equation well. He'd seen it before, in boardrooms where his ideas were echoed by someone else and suddenly considered genius. At luxury hotels where his ID was double-checked while others waltzed in unbothered. In interviews where investors asked more about how he got there than where he was going. His entire life had been a quiet resistance against these invisible barriers. And yet here they were again. At 40,000 feet, he glanced over at the man across the aisle. Mid-50s, ruddy-faced, sipping a third glass of wine, laughing loudly at a joke Darius didn't care to hear. A flight attendant lingered beside him, smiling, leaning in just a little too close. The man said something about hiring a whole new fleet, and the attendant laughed like he was hilarious. She reached for his glass before he even had to ask. And Darius saw it then, not just the inequality, but the comfort of it. How normalized it had become, how those in power never had to think twice about whether they belonged. He did. Every day. He shifted slightly in his seat and reached for his tablet again. Not to review the merger slides, he couldn't focus on projections and ROI margins right now. Instead, he opened his secure comms app. His fingers hovered above the screen, then typed out 4 simple words to Marcus Brandt: prepare internal audit protocol. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. Marcus would know what it meant. Marcus always did. For 10 more minutes, Darius said nothing, did nothing. But he watched. He counted the refills, tracked the glances, took mental inventory of who got offered wine first, who got smiled at, who didn't even get acknowledged. And with each quiet observation, his resolve hardened, not from anger, but from principle. The difference mattered, because anger was fleeting, but principle that had teeth. The plane hummed steadily beneath him, a mechanical heartbeat cruising over the Atlantic. But Darius's own pulse had slowed, sharpened, not with rage but with precision. On the screen in front of him, the message to Marcus had already been marked as received. There would be no further questions. That was the rhythm of their relationship, built not on pleasantries, but on clarity and performance. When Darius spoke, Marcus executed. Internal audit protocol was code. A layered instruction. It didn't mean calling HR. It didn't mean logging a complaint into some forgotten form. It meant prepare for war quietly. Darius returned the tablet to its leather sleeve and folded his hands in his lap. From the outside, he looked like a man simply enjoying the flight, a high-powered executive content in his private space. But inside, gears were turning. He wasn't planning retribution, he was designing accountability. His eyes shifted once again to the front of the cabin. The flight attendant who had dismissed his pre-order was now laughing with another passenger seated in 1C. Her laughter had an edge to it, practiced, deliberate, a service mask that came off for some and stayed glued on for others. Darius noted the difference. The way her body leaned in slightly toward the man in 1C, the casual confidence in her posture. She had made a choice earlier. A small one, she might say. But small choices made in repetition form systems. Darius had spent his life identifying those systems and dismantling them. He pulled out his phone and opened a different app. A secure portal linked to the cabin monitoring system on Stratus Air's premier flights. Few knew it existed. Fewer still knew Darius himself had approved its creation 6 months prior, after a rash of complaints had quietly raised internal flags. The cabin surveillance system was designed to protect staff and passengers alike. It wasn't intrusive, no big brother, no facial recognition, just a smart camera and directional audio system tucked into the paneling of first class, activated only on executive approval. Darius's approval, his fingers tapped a few commands. Request Cabin 1, Flight 917, timestamp 0034, 17 0054, 00, video plus directional audio notes, isolate meal service interaction and passenger prioritization behavior. He hit send. Then leaned back. No grand gestures, no raised voices, no performance of power. The work had already begun. Outside, the stars stretched across the sky like a quiet canopy. Inside, Darius sat still, waiting, watching, not for the sake of vengeance, but for evidence. Because some people still needed proof, and Darius Coleman was ready to provide it in full color and HD. Thousands of miles away in the heart of downtown Chicago, a single notification flashed on a monitor inside Coleman Global's 24/7 operations hub. Marcus Brandt didn't flinch. It was 2:42 a.m., but he was always awake when Darius flew internationally. Not because of micromanagement, but because precision was part of his DNA. Marcus wasn't just an executive assistant, he was a strategist, a fixer, a shadow arm of Darius's influence. And tonight, he knew the storm had begun. He opened the secure request internal audit protocol cabin footage, timestamped with audio emphasis. No additional instructions, none needed. Marcus pushed his chair back and entered a biometric command into the system. The screen brightened, illuminating a split-screen dashboard, flight logs, staff, manifests, passenger history, and most crucially, cabin crew personnel files for Flight 917 and he scanned the roster. 3 names, 2 women, 1 man, 1 name blinked, highlighted automatically by the system's complaint tracking AI. Alert attendant ID number 4162, status repeat, behavioral flag, selective guest prioritization incidents logged. Action taken, informal coaching, no formal reprimand. Marcus's jaw clenched slightly. He clicked through the records, his brow furrowing with each entry. The language was familiar, dismissive attitude, delayed service, disproportionate attention to certain guests, pre-ordered meal, forgotten, same patterns, different passengers. One complaint had come from a woman traveling with her elderly father, another from a Latino entrepreneur en route to a startup summit, another from a black professor headed to a diversity conference in Copenhagen. All eerily similar, all brushed aside. Marcus pulled the data into a single dossier, adding a cover memo marked urgent. He attached Darius's audit request, including a note surveillance video pending. Advise immediate HR escalation upon confirmation. He paused for a second before hitting send. Then, almost as an afterthought, he pulled up the HR compliance officer's directory and flagged the attendant's history to the internal oversight board. No alarms, no fire drills, just quiet systems activating. Marcus leaned back in his chair and took a sip of black coffee, now lukewarm. He stared at the blinking cursor of the secure system, thinking. This wasn't a one-time incident. This was a thread unraveling from the core of Stratus Air's polished image. And Darius had just pulled it. Back on Flight 9115, the hum of the engines had become a background lullaby, a sound meant to soothe first-class passengers into indulgent comfort. But Darius Coleman wasn't comforted. He was calculating. From his seat in 1A, he stared out the window, the faint reflection of his own face staring back at him from the glass. A man used to being watched, a man who had decided long ago he had rather be the one doing the watching. A soft chime echoed from his phone confirmation. The request for the surveillance footage had been received and the process was underway. Within minutes, the directional cameras and mics embedded discreetly throughout the cabin would begin uploading the necessary segment to the secure cloud vault, accessible only to executive-level clearance. Darius tapped the screen again. Supplement request. Flag all interactions involving attendant ID number 4162. Prioritize audio with guest service discrepancies. Additional directive. Real-time backup to Coleman Global Terminal. He set the phone aside and reached for his water. Not because he was thirsty, but because the ritual gave his hands something to do. He took a slow sip, letting the bland taste wash across his tongue. Even the water, he thought, had felt like an afterthought. A symbol of the service he'd received. He turned his gaze back to the cabin. The same attendant who had so casually denied him his pre-ordered meal was now pouring a fourth glass of wine for the gentleman in 1D. She laughed lightly at something he said, the kind of laugh you reserve for someone you believe matters. She hadn't looked at Darius again. Not once. It wasn't guilt. It was dismissal. She had written him off from the first moment. His skin tone. His silence, his unwillingness to assert dominance had made her decide he was unimportant. One of the unexceptional. One of the ones you could forget, brush past, prioritize beneath others. She had no idea that the system watching her now had been created by the man she'd snubbed. Darius's mind drifted back to a meeting 6 months earlier, Stratus Air's boardroom. A heated discussion about escalating complaints from high-tier passengers, subtle patterns, not loud incidents. Microaggressions in luxury. That was how one director had phrased it. Darius had listened in silence. Then he'd proposed the enhanced monitoring pilot, directional video, smart audio logging behavior analytics built right into the cabin infrastructure. It would protect staff from false claims and passengers from invisible mistreatment. Some had called it excessive. He had called it necessary. Now, as the plane glided over Europe, those systems were bearing fruit. What the crew didn't know, what few in the company even remembered, was that this flight was part of the pilot program. And now the pilot program had found its test case. Darius didn't smile. He didn't need to. Truth didn't need applause. It only needed light. And soon that light would be very, very bright. Some cabins sing of quiet luxury. This one reeked of quiet hierarchy. Darius remained still in his seat, his fingers gently drumming against the tray table. The rhythm had returned steady, purposeful. Each tap a silent act of endurance, a silent counter to everything happening around him. To the untrained eye, everything appeared normal. First-class passengers reclined in their spacious seats, swirled aged spirits in delicate glasses, and chuckled through half-whispered conversations that buzzed with entitlement. Flight attendants moved like dancers across a familiar stage, balancing plates and pleasantries with elegance. But to Darius, the choreography was flawed. He had seen enough. He watched as the attendant in question breezed past him again, twice without even making eye contact. She stopped for extended conversations with the men in 1C and 2A, knelt to their level when they asked for anything, refilled their drinks before the glass touched the bottom. When she passed Darius, it was as though his seat was an empty shell. He was not served. He was managed. This wasn't bad service. This was filtered service. It was the performance of hospitality tailored for an audience that matched the script. And Darius, he wasn't part of the cast. He glanced briefly to the left. Another passenger had dropped his napkin. The attendant noticed it, immediately bent to pick it up, and smiled as she handed him a fresh one. 3 rows behind an elderly man, dressed more modestly, requested assistance with his seat. She didn't hear him. or chose not to. Darius leaned back and folded his arms. His memory catalogued each moment, not just the ones affecting him, but everyone else too. The story wasn't just about how he had been excluded. It was about how others had been elevated. That's how injustice worked best in contrast. And this contrast was blinding. He turned his gaze back to the window. Clouds rolled beneath the aircraft like a silent, endless ocean. His own reflection stared back at him again, still composed, still immovable. Behind that calm was a man assembling a case brick by brick. Outside of the plane's elegant illusion, Marcus would be receiving the full behavioral footage any moment now. The system's AI would isolate key gestures, tone inflections, and disparities in service delivery. Stratus had always prided itself on excellence. Now it was about to witness how excellence left unchecked by accountability becomes exclusion. The other passengers sipped their drinks. The attendant continued her show. But the curtain had already started to fall. The descent into Geneva began with a gentle shift barely perceptible, but enough to cause the cabin lights to dim and the seatbelt chimes to echo softly overhead. Passengers adjusted their seats. Attendants moved briskly, securing trays and whispering final checks. But in 1A, Darius remained perfectly still. He wasn't thinking about customs forms or transportation arrangements. He wasn't reviewing presentation notes for the billion-dollar merger scheduled tomorrow morning. That part of his mind, the strategist, the CEO, was quiet now. What occupied him was the slow unfurling of a plan meticulously timed to culminate the moment the plane touched Earth. He had initiated every piece. Each silent signal, each request, each audit, every step had been designed not to create noise but consequence. And now Geneva's city lights twinkled beneath them like a field of distant stars, unaware that a different kind of fire was about to land. Darius adjusted his tie, not out of necessity but habit. The last act of composure, the final scene before revelation. Behind him, the cabin crew bustled. The same attendant passed once more, her expression unchanged. She smiled at the passenger in 1C, placing a folded napkin in his hand with practiced grace. She didn't even glance in Darius's direction. It didn't matter now. She had made her decision, and he had made his. Moments later, the tires met tarmac with a subtle thud, and the plane glided along the runway with mechanical ease. A flawless landing, the kind Stratus Air was famous for. But some landings signal endings. This one signaled beginning. As passengers began to stretch and gather belongings, the energy inside the cabin shifted to anticipation calls, being made meetings, being confirmed, assistants being summoned. Darius remained seated. He wasn't in a rush. His arrival wasn't dictated by time, it was dictated by precision, and precision had already taken its place at the gate. 2 Stratus Air corporate officials stood discreetly just outside the aircraft door. Dressed in dark navy suits, their expressions were unreadable, neutral masks honed in countless hours of executive response training. When the door opened, they stepped inside wordlessly. One of them nodded toward Darius with a respectful but subtle tone. "Mr. Coleman, this way, please." Darius rose, collected his tablet, and followed them into the jet bridge. His steps slow, deliberate, silent. He didn't glance back at the flight crew. He didn't need to, because they hadn't noticed yet. But they would. They would feel it first in the silence when the passengers were gone and the usual rush of disembarkation was replaced by something else. A delay, an unfamiliar stillness, and then it would come. The second team. Human resources, compliance officers, and Marcus Brandt standing just outside the crew holding room dossier in hand, data queued, video ready, and names already marked. The cabin crew didn't know it yet, but the audit had begun before they ever poured the first glass of wine. Their mistake wasn't just poor service, it was assuming no one would notice. Inside the quiet glass-walled holding lounge, just past the executive arrivals corridor, the air was still. Almost too still. The crew had been asked to remain seated not by a gate agent, but by 2 uniformed officers from Stratus Air's corporate HR division. Their expressions were firm, unreadable. Their presence alone disrupted the post-flight routine. The attendant who had denied Darius's meal stood near the corner of the room, arms crossed, posture casual but eyes unsettled. She kept glancing toward the door, her expression bouncing between confusion and defensiveness. "What's this about?" She whispered to a colleague. No one answered. No one could. They had all felt it by now. Something had gone wrong. Something big, but they didn't know what. Not yet. Then the door opened, and silence pressed in like a weight. Darius Coleman stepped inside. No entourage, no fanfare, just a calm, powerful presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. He didn't speak right away. He looked at each of them one by one, slowly. His eyes were sharp, composed, but what lingered beneath them was unmistakable finality. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice smooth and low. I was a passenger on your flight today. A pause, heavy, surgical. You made choices during that flight, choices that, while small in appearance, carry significant meaning, especially when those choices repeat themselves. He let the sentence hang like a blade. The room shifted. Breath caught. No one dared to interrupt. Darius turned his gaze to the attendant who had denied him. She straightened reflexively, masking discomfort with practiced poise. It was just a mistake, she said quickly. A mix-up in the system. These things happen. No, Darius cut in, calm but absolute. They don't just happen. Not when they follow a pattern. Not when they've happened to people who look like me, again and again and again. He stepped forward. I have the footage, he said evenly. I have the audio. I have your guest interaction history, your previous complaint records, and the list of passengers who received full service ahead of me, despite confirmed documentation to the contrary. Her lips parted, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. Behind Darius, Marcus entered the room and handed him a thin folder inside time-stamped video stills. Written summaries, 3 previous incident logs, and a formal recommendation for immediate dismissal. Darius didn't hand it to the crew. He handed it to the HR officer standing by the door. He looked back at the team. Not with anger, not with gloating, just a quiet finality. You are hereby dismissed from service effective immediately. The words dropped like thunder in a vacuum. No theatrics, no arguments, just silence. Security officers stepped into the room, calm but firm. One by one, the crew members were escorted out, some stunned, some defiant, all speechless. Darius remained behind as they left, not out of satisfaction, but to ensure the process was complete, to ensure the silence had meaning. 2 days later, sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows of Stratus Air's corporate headquarters. The boardroom was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of paper and the soft tap of a pen against a notepad. 12 executives sat around a gleaming mahogany table, each one waiting, expectant, calculating. At the head of the table sat Darius Coleman. He didn't posture. He didn't fill silence with pleasantries. He simply tapped once on his tablet, and the large screen behind him came to life. What played wasn't a dramatic montage or a fiery speech. It was footage, clear, time-stamped, unedited. It showed a man himself being skipped over, disregarded, dismissed. It showed other passengers being fawned over, pampered, prioritized. And then it showed the attendant her words, her tone, her shrug, that had sparked an audit now rippling through the highest levels of the airline. No one at the table moved. Darius let the video finish before he spoke. This wasn't just about one flight, he said, voice even. It's not about one employee or one bad moment. This is a cultural flaw that's been allowed to persist in silence. He tapped again. A slide of complaint statistics appeared, grouped by race, gender, and position in the cabin. The patterns were irrefutable. Discretionary service, Darius continued, has become a synonym for systemic exclusion. And if we don't correct it loudly and visibly, it will define this brand more than any luxury we offer. A few board members shifted in their seats. An older director, white-haired and skeptical, finally spoke. Darius, the incident was unfortunate, but terminating staff without broader review, won't that send the wrong signal to the unions? Darius didn't blink. No, he said, it sends the right one to the public, to our clients, to the future of this airline. He leaned forward. We don't just fly people. We send a message with every interaction. If that message says some passengers matter more than others, then no amount of 5-star marketing can save us. Silence returned, this time heavier. Then a younger board member cleared her throat. What do you propose? Darius swiped again. A multi-phase initiative appeared. Mandatory bias training for all crew and frontline staff. executive oversight protocols for cabin behavior reviews, anonymous passenger feedback tied to staff evaluations, quarterly inclusion audits conducted independently, zero-tolerance clause embedded in all customer-facing job contracts. He paused. And all of it starts with transparency, he said. We publish our numbers, we show our reform, and we make it clear luxury without equity is not luxury. It's a lie. There was a long beat of silence. Then the chairman nodded once firmly. I support this. One by one, others followed. In 5 minutes, the plan was approved. In 15, a press statement was drafted. And in 30, Darius was appointed to lead the new division of passenger experience reform, with full authority to rebuild not just service protocol, but Stratus Air's internal culture. He didn't smile, not because he wasn't proud, but because he understood this wasn't victory. This was the beginning of the real work. Approval was one thing. Implementation, that was where the real battle began. Darius knew this. Every reformist does. The day after the board's unanimous vote, emails went out across departments. Memos, meeting invites, orientation packets for the new training modules, press releases announcing a commitment to equity, public applause from media outlets that had once ignored corporate ethics stories now called it visionary. But behind the curtain, old habits stirred. Whispers circulated in executive lounges. He's overreacting. It was just a service issue. This is going to tank morale. One VP in the Flight Operations Division privately questioned the move. We've been doing fine for years now. We're throwing everything into chaos for one incident. The phrase repeated in hallway conversations like a prayer of denial. One incident. But Darius wasn't fooled. He didn't wait for backlash. He anticipated it. At his command, Marcus conducted a pattern review of internal complaints filed over the past 5 years. Dozens of reports ignored or buried were recompiled, sorted, analyzed. Names began to reappear. Certain crew members had accumulated soft flags, phrases like unequal tone, subtle hostility, delayed attention enough to form a mosaic of quiet bias. One by one, the mosaic turned into a map. Darius marked it with pins, not vengeance. Accountability. But that word alone made some tremble. A small faction of middle-tier executives pushed back subtly. Budget restrictions, scheduling conflicts, union language. They didn't say, "This isn't worth it." They said, "This might be too much, too fast." It was the language of delay. And Darius had no patience for it. He called a town hall, mandatory attendance, all departments, all ranks. He stood on the stage, not behind a podium, not above them, but beside a single chair. "I want to tell you a story," he began. "You've heard the headlines. Some of you have even sent messages of support. But here's what I need you to understand. This didn't happen to me. It happened through me." He paused, because what I experienced on that plane wasn't new. It was familiar, and not just to me, but to thousands of passengers who never had the leverage to speak up. He stepped forward, and I'm not here to burn down a company. I'm here to clear out the smoke we've pretended isn't there. A beat. Then the quiet clapping began from a younger flight attendant in the front row. Then another and another. It wasn't thunderous, it was honest. When the meeting ended, a few department heads stayed behind. This time their language had changed. No more hedging, no more excuses. "Let's get to work," one of them said. And Darius nodded finally, allowing himself a breath. The tide was shifting, not because of policy, but because culture, when challenged by courage, cannot stay hidden. Reform doesn't happen in boardrooms. It happens in break rooms, in simulator cabins, in training halls, in the way people talk about passengers when they think no one is listening. Darius knew this. That's why he didn't stop with policies or memos. He began reconstructing Stratus Air's service model from the foundation up, not just as a response to injustice, but as an investment in dignity. The first change came quietly, a new onboarding program. Every new crew member, from flight attendants to senior cabin supervisors, now underwent a redesigned orientation rooted in behavioral psychology, empathy modeling, and real-world bias training. No more corporate platitudes. No more checkbox compliance. The curriculum wasn't created by PR consultants. It was crafted by former passengers, those who had filed complaints, who had experienced subtle slights and overt exclusion, whose stories had once sat unread in a digital archive. Darius brought those voices into the classroom. Every scenario used was real, and it changed things. Even the most seasoned attendants, those who'd flown for decades, sat in silence as they watched footage from Flight 917, reviewed interaction transcripts, and faced the question, what would you have done differently? Some wept, some resisted, but none left unaffected. The second change came with accountability. Darius introduced a new digital reporting tool that allowed any passenger to submit a real-time evaluation linked securely to staff reviews with AI analysis, filtering patterns of praise and concern. It wasn't just about watching, it was about listening and acting. Supervisors could no longer ignore feedback flagged with racial, gendered, or class-related language. Crew performance bonuses were now tied to more than just efficiency and punctuality. Empathy was a metric, not a slogan. The third reform was perhaps the most radical, a restructuring of the leadership chain itself. Darius quietly dissolved two senior roles that had repeatedly stalled inclusion projects in the past. In their place, he promoted frontline leaders, people who understood the pulse of customer experience not from spreadsheets but from aisle 13. One such leader, a biracial former attendant named Clara, was made head of cultural competency for international routes. In her first week, she hosted an anonymous roundtable with crew who admitted some for the first time that they had felt pressured to prioritize guests based on status appearance or unspoken assumptions. That admission became policy. That honesty became architecture. Back at headquarters, Marcus compiled the quarterly metrics. Complaints down. Internal engagement up. Passenger satisfaction, particularly from underrepresented groups, had climbed to its highest percentage in 5 years. Still, Darius didn't frame it as a victory. It's a recalibration, he said in an internal newsletter, not just of service, but of soul. He walked the halls more now, unannounced, sat in on training sessions, asked new hires what dignity meant to them, not in theory, but in practice. And slowly he began to hear answers that weren't rehearsed. They were lived. Stratus Air was becoming something different, not perfect, but intentional. 3 months later, Flight 1212 lifted off the tarmac with the same soft hum that Darius had heard 100 times before. But this flight was different. Because this time it was his system in the air. The aircraft interior shimmered with the same quiet luxury, linen napkins, leather seats, crystal glasses, but something less visible had changed. Not the lighting, not the branding, the energy. As he settled into seat 1A once more, Darius looked around not with skepticism but curiosity. The attendant who greeted him was a tall young man in his late 20s, eyes alert, posture respectful but unforced. His name tag read Tobias. There was no awkward overcompensation, no hollow deference, just clear-eyed attentiveness. "Good evening, Mr. Coleman," Tobias said with a small nod. "I'll be assisting you throughout the flight. If there's anything at all you need, any preference you have, please feel free to let me know. No script, no stiffness, just presence." Darius offered a nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you." Within minutes, a glass of still water was served cold crisp and offered with subtle consideration. The menu followed. He was offered 2 meal options, both still available. When he selected the seared halibut and grilled asparagus, Tobias didn't flinch. "It will be prepared as requested," he replied, tapping gently on the digital tablet. "And I've made a note about the timing. We'll bring your meal after the initial quiet period, unless you'd prefer earlier." This was what reform looked like when it lived, not in announcements, but in alignment. Across the cabin, Darius saw other moments, small ones, that revealed a cultural shift. An older passenger in 2C struggled with his seatbelt clasp. A nearby attendant leaned in quietly, offering help without making a show of it. A family traveling with a non-verbal child received a soft packet of noise-cancelling headphones before takeoff. It wasn't flashy, it was thoughtful. Even the way the crew spoke among themselves had changed, quieter, more collaborative, less performative. He had reviewed the data, the improvement in customer sentiment scores, the boost in staff morale, the feedback from passengers who noticed a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. But this was his first time feeling it. Not as a CEO. As a passenger, as the aircraft cruised into its assigned altitude, Darius looked out the window. This wasn't the same man who had boarded Flight 917. That man had carried the weight of being dismissed, denied, disregarded. This one carried the satisfaction of action. He hadn't waited for apologies. He had built the alternative. And the air felt lighter for it. Tobias returned just before dinner service holding a folded note. From the crew, he said, placing it gently on Darius's tray. Darius opened it. In neat, careful handwriting, the message read, "Thank you for fighting a quiet fight most never even see. We're proud to serve this flight and this mission with you." He folded the note slowly, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and looked up at Tobias with something rare, a genuine smile. For the remainder of the flight, Darius didn't touch his tablet. The numbers could wait. The forecasts, the expansion plans, the cross-continental negotiations, they all paled in comparison to the quiet revolution unfolding right here, 38,000 feet above the ground. He reclined his seat not out of weariness, but to observe. To witness what dignity looked like when it was no longer demanded, but embedded. The dinner service arrived precisely as scheduled. The halibut was plated with care, the asparagus firm and fragrant. A glass of white wine accompanied the meal, and the attendant who delivered it gave a subtle nod, not subservient, not performative. Just human. For the first time in a long while, Darius ate without calculation. Each bite was a small affirmation, not of food, but of progress. He could still remember the taste of the sandwich from Flight 917, not because it was bad, but because it had been delivered with cold indifference. It hadn't been a meal, it had been a message. This was a conversation. And the handwritten note in his jacket pocket felt heavier than any policy document or audit report he had ever signed. "Thank you for fighting a quiet fight most never even see." That line echoed in his mind as he gazed out the window, watching the sunset stretch across the clouds like golden silk. It wasn't about him. That was the part few understood. It had never been about a luxury meal. It wasn't about asserting superiority. It wasn't even about proving a point. It was about ensuring that no passenger, regardless of their appearance, their accent, their silence, would ever be made to feel invisible again. Invisibility, after all, was the most common form of erasure. But not today, not on this flight. Around him, the cabin buzzed with quiet contentment. People sipped wine, read books, whispered to loved ones across plush seats. No one seemed aware of the transformation, and that perhaps was the greatest victory of all. True change, Darius thought, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just replaces the old silence with a better one. He pressed the service button, not because he needed anything, but because he wanted to say something. When Tobias approached, Darius looked up. "Tell your team," he said calmly. "They're doing more than serving. They're restoring something that should have never been taken for granted." Tobias didn't respond immediately. Then, with the same quiet steadiness that had marked the entire flight, he said, "We've learned that dignity isn't a luxury, it's the baseline." Darius nodded. Finally, someone had said it aloud. The aircraft began its descent as the city lights below shimmered like a map of possibility. From his seat in 1A, Darius watched the glow through the glass reflections flickering across his eyes like soft reminders of where he had been, of what had changed and what still remained. The seatbelt sign pinged overhead. Passengers began to stir, folding trays, straightening ties, closing books. But Darius stayed still, heart steady, mind turning not toward the landing, but toward the legacy now rising beneath his feet. This was never about one flight, or even one airline. This was about momentum, about the quiet ways systems transform, not through headlines or hashtags, but through decisions made in silence, upheld in service, and carried forward by people who choose to do better, even when no one is watching. And now people were watching, not because he demanded attention, but because he showed what happens when someone with power chooses to use it not to dominate, but to rebuild. Stratus Air had changed. The metrics showed it. The testimonials confirmed it. But most of all, the atmosphere proved it on this flight, on the last, in the lounges, the training rooms, the language of leadership that no longer tolerated silence where it should scream. And it had started with a refusal to accept a lukewarm sandwich. As the plane touched down with a gentle thud, a strange emotion crept into Darius's chest. Not triumph, not vindication, gratitude. For the resistance, for the quiet fight, For the truth that dignity once restored doesn't just live in policies or procedures, but in posture, tone, and presence. The wheels rolled to a stop. A soft chime signaled arrival. As the doors opened and passengers rose, Darius gathered his things slowly, deliberately. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. This time the cabin waited for him. As he stepped into the jet bridge, another attendant, a young woman from the next crew rotation, offered a nod that was deeper than protocol. She recognized him. Not just the name, but the story. "Welcome home, Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice steady. "We've been expecting you." He nodded, returning her gaze, and stepped forward. Outside, the city awaited. Inside, a legacy had been born. Not of revenge, not of reaction, but of responsibility. And it would fly with every seat, every tray, every interaction from this moment forward. A new kind of turbulence had passed, and in its place the skies had cleared.